Hi, my name is Amanda Kraus. I'm an assistant director at the University of Arizona Disability Resource Center, an adjunct faculty for the Center for the Study of Higher Education. And today we're going to talk about reframing disability. The goals for this session are to introduce dominant societal frames that we use to understand disability, to examine how these frames influence our professional practice, to reflect on the power of language, media, and design in shaping the disability experience, and identify ways to design more sustainable and accessible experiences. And then we'll do a quick review of resources and services available through the university's Disability Resource Center. So when we talk about frames, a frame shapes our ideas. It shapes how we think about a certain concept. So how we see the world relative to this idea, our goals, our policies, the way we act, the way we speak. So the prevalent frame on disability kind of frames disability as an individual's impairment. It uses a deficit approach, so considering that the person with the disability is at a deficit. And the ultimate goal of this frame is to cure or fix the disability or the person with the disability. So even though we don't really think about it, we do intersect with this frame often, particularly through our language, media, and design of different systems in our communities. Now, when we think about this individual frame, it really does keep the disabled person kind of separate from the rest of the community and perhaps reliant on non-disabled people or professionals to help or fix or cure. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be talking about this frame, but then also an emerging frame that might present some interesting opportunities for us in our work and in our lives to conceptualize disability. So here is some language that is pretty common in our vernacular. So when we say these words or when we hear these words, we don't often think about how they might be connected to the disability experience or disability history because they're so common in our everyday language. So we will spend a little bit of time talking about language today, and my goal is not to police language, certainly not for a session like this, but merely to put some words or some terms on our radar and start having you consider the impact of language as it relates to disability. So when we see this type of disability language, on this list, we have some euphemisms. We have certain choices that really do reflect our values relative to disability. So again, these are word choices, and I think that when we talk about disability, or even when we talk about social justice or sensitive topics, in general, we become concerned about our language, and we become maybe interested in being as politically correct or as sensitive as we can be relative to a certain topic. So, when it comes to disability, we use certain terms to discuss the experience, but really, what are the impact of these choices? So when we're talking about special needs, handy-capable, these types of euphemisms, they don't name disability, and they imply that disability is negative or so bad that we wouldn't want to talk about it, we wouldn't want to name it. And so just kind of considering those choices can help us evaluate our values relative to disability. So, take a look at these terms, these labels, and think about the potential impact that they would have on both disabled and non-disabled individuals. This list in particular also kind of reinforces that the problem lies within the individual. So there are some subtle messages or subtle implications of this language that we want to become aware of. Here are some disability terms that are more relative to helping or certain professions, maybe more relative to this audience, perhaps, that also kind of reinforce this one-up, one-down dynamic when it comes to disabilities. So words like support, service, special, who's eligible. There's this whole concept of eligibility when it comes to disability. So this language reinforces that, again, disabled people have a problem and they need either professionals or who are probably not disabled to empower them, to help them be successful. It also kind of insinuates that disabled people will have to continually advocate for their own needs, that it has to come from within the disability community or the individual. So again, the goal of addressing some of these terms or word choices is not to tell you never to say these words, but merely to think about the impact of those words when you hear them or use them or when you see them in your professional areas. So another way that we intersect with this kind of dominant frame around disability is through the media. The media has several themes that are relevant to disability, and they continually use these themes to represent disability. One real prevalent idea about disability that the media perpetuates is the idea that disability is tragic and pitiful. We see this quite often. We also see that disability is a fate worse than death. If you've ever seen the movie $1 Million Baby, which several years ago was nominated and won several Academy Awards, the whole premise of the movie was kind of choosing disability or death. There's also a fear of becoming disabled. This could happen to you. This could happen to any one of us. Villains, and actually almost every Disney villain has some sort of disability or difference that's identifiable. So when you think about Captain Hook, he's actually an amputee, but these messages are so subtle, and we've been socialized with Disney and with these messages that we don't often think critically about how it's teaching everyone, again, disabled people and non-disabled people, what it means to have a disability. So then also in the media, disability is often portrayed as inspirational. There's a concept called the super crip, which basically means that a disabled individual has overcome their disability. They're so normal and so cool and so much an overachiever that you don't even know that they're disabled. There's also a lot of charity relative to disability. Telethons are pretty contentious in the disability studies or disability community. Always the idea that your spare change could help eliminate this type of problem or fix this type of problem. And also human interest pieces. There's a lot of human interest pieces about disabled folks. I can think of, the Today Show or just the local news or local newspaper highlighting disabled folks kind of just living their lives. So I often wonder, and I would ask you to wonder, what is the news in a story like that? So again, this is kind of not necessarily a challenge, but an opportunity for you to look more critically at the media and see where you can recognize these themes being replicated. Here are some stills, some photos of different media characters. So there's Jerry Lewis and the telethon. There's a shot from Glee where there's a disabled character on the show. However, the actor in real life is not disabled. Forrest Gump. There's a character in Forrest Gump who's a disabled veteran, very kind of stereotypical. And there's Captain Hook and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So again, Disney has lots of characters that have disabilities, but we don't probably think about them very readily. So anyway, just kind of thinking about what you see in the media and what the media teaches us all about the disability experience. So we're going to spend some time talking about design, which is really exciting because I think that there's a lot of potential and a lot of great opportunity for us to use good concepts in designing anything that we have in our scope, in our sphere, whether that's an event or a information or an experience. So the different kind of arenas that we can think about relative to design. Information, so anything you put online, any media that you create, literature. Policy, of course. Instruction, so for those of you responsible for teaching courses, doing trainings. Programs and services. And just kind of social, thinking about how these structures shape our attitudes relevant to, in this case, disability. here are some examples, I mean, big examples of design. So you see kind of some physical access right there, a short flight of steps adjacent to a ramp. This is kind of what I would say has been retrofitted, an entrance or an exit that's been retrofitted to become accessible. But we see examples of this all the time out in the community. We see closed captioning, which is, of course, an effort to be accessible, although sometimes it's hard to find closed captioning in certain TV stations or movies. And then right there at the bottom is a Scantron exam. So it's an answer sheet. And this is a really popular way to design an exam or a learning assessment. And so we want to start thinking about what barriers these design mechanisms present to access and to inclusion. So this is where the exciting emerging frame comes into play, because we can start thinking about disability differently from that original kind of individual frame, looking at the disability as an individual's impairment, something that resides in me, the individual. But now starting to shift our focus and look at the environment and how the environment designs and presents barriers that disable people. So when we start to shift our attention looking at the environment, it allows us to consider that disability is socially constructed, the way many of us think about gender or race or religion. That it's actually the environment that creates barriers that exclude certain people from participation. Not necessarily only disabled people, but certain people. And again, that could be a physical access, that could be curricular, policy, or kind of attitudinal ideas. This idea comes out of disability studies, which is an academic discipline. It's interdisciplinary, and it looks at how disability kind of intersects and is interwoven into various fields such as history, media, literature. This is a very kind of activist community, activist idea. There's great research coming out of disability studies, and so I do want to just quickly mention it so that if you're interested, you could read up on disability studies. But it really helps us reimagine the disability experience as something that can be valued. Disability is something that can enrich our communities, that can increase the diversity, the wonderful kind of richness and diversity of our communities. And so that's where this idea is kind of born out of. So when we're looking kind of side by side at the two prevalent or dominant frames, with the individual frame, again, the core beliefs is that we locate the problem within the individual. We have a focus on the impairment. We consider that disabled person to be at a deficit. And that means that we don't really internalize disability as part of an identity. We really isolate it to the specific impairment. And then the response is that we want to fix or cure. And that looks often like we kind of make individual accommodations for folks, and we'll talk more about that. When we move to this more kind of emerging or socio-political frame, we're locating the problem in the environment. We're kind of seeing disability as neutral or even positive, because once we're looking at barriers to access, if we can identify and remove those barriers, the impact of the disability becomes a bit different. Because regardless of disability, the person can still participate and access various programs, services, et cetera. Kind of in response to the socio-political model, we want to, again, identify those barriers, remove them. We want to consider new ways to design experiences that are accessible, that are inclusive to the largest audience possible. And then we start to then begin to appreciate disability as a real valuable, important part of our community, not something that needs to be isolated or separate or different. So when we think about reflecting on these two models, just for your own kind of reflection, where do you often see these frames represented, let's say in your work, or when you think about the Tucson community or the University of Arizona community? where do you see examples of either this individual frame or the socio-political frame? And then what do you really think the impact is on again, both disabled and non-disabled people? Because we've all been socialized in this society to think about disability in a certain way. And relevant to professional practice, we always want to think about how disability is represented in our organizations, in our agencies. So from our websites, where do we see images of disability? Where do we see language about access and inclusion or disability? When you think about physical access, what does that feel like? What does that look like? So these are the types of reflective questions we can be kind of grappling with to maybe make some good change around how disability is represented. So we always want to be minding the gap, right, between what we believe about diversity and social justice and access, and then what we actually do in our daily lives, in our daily practice, language, design, et cetera. So really trying to become congruent there with what we believe and what we do. So we might have heard about universal design, which is a concept that was kind of developed in architecture. So again, not something that's disability specific, but just looking at good design, good access. So when we think about universal design, we want to design for the largest audience, the largest number of consumers. It is not disability specific. So we'll often hear, we'll hear about, the wheelchair access ramp or the automatic door opener. And we think that those are kind of accommodations for disabled folks. And while, of course, they do work for disabled folks, they're not specifically intended for disabled folks. Lots of people benefit from these types of access points and accommodations. When we consider that large audience, that diverse audience, what it does is it reduces or potentially eliminates our need for individual accommodations. It creates an access that's seamless. So the access is built right in. And this will often mean that the design is more sustainable, which means that I'll give you an example of, let's say, a classroom or a learning assessment or test. Each semester, the Disability Resource Center will work with faculty in designing tests that are more inclusive. But for folks who aren't able to create a test or change their model for testing so it can be inclusive to all students, what ends up happening is that semester after semester, students will come to the faculty member or come to the Disability Resource Center looking for an individual accommodation. So it's individual accommodation after individual accommodation. Or if we look at where the barrier lies, which in this example is the test, what if we redesigned the test so that it was more inclusive? The faculty member could do this maybe once and not have to facilitate the individual accommodation semester after semester. So that's kind of what I mean about thinking of that largest possible audience and how we can make design that's just sustainable, access that's sustainable. And what will ultimately happen is that we're cultivating a more welcoming and inclusive environment for all people. And that, I think, is our goal, especially here at the University of Arizona, where we're concerned with creating a safe and inclusive community for everyone. So continuing to talk about design, basically we want to think about effective services. And so, versus what's legally mandated. So sometimes when we start talking about disability and accommodations, we get all wrapped up into what do we have to do? What does the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, tell us we have to do? What do I have to do to work with this student? But if we can kind of shift our thinking there and think about what can we do? What can we do to make this experience good for everyone, accessible for everyone, inclusive to everyone? That's going to open up a lot of possibilities for us all. So we want to consider how people can take advantage of the same product in the same means. Everyone's kind of included right away. Another tenet of good design or universal design is that you want to use multiple means of participation. So alternate formats are kind of built in. They'll be standard. When you're providing information, let's say for a presentation or a class, You can provide information online. You could provide electronic copies, accessible documents that people can choose to use the way that they want to. They can choose to print them out. They could choose to manipulate the size or the contrast or the color. So when you've thought about that at the front end, you know, it's not a problem. People can participate and do what they need to do to be successful, ultimately, which is what we want. This means that hopefully disabled people will not need to continually advocate for their own needs. And this is something that, you know, really is an important impact, I would say, of the disability experience, is that, you know, it's usually up to the disabled person to say, I can't access this test, or can I ask you a question, or I'm confused about the access. So if we can try to think about that experience right up front, we're eliminating the need for a disabled person to be wondering, to be anxious, to be thinking about all of their needs. You know, something that happens, I think, with the disability experience is that the needs of disabled people become kind of labeled as special needs. And that's something that I really want us to be thinking about as we're doing this work and we're doing this type of reflection. Because I think that folks have the same needs. Maybe in our case, the need is to get an education. The need is to enter or exit a building. The need is to read a book. So I don't consider those needs to be special, but it really does highlight how design can relegate certain people's needs as different or special versus just kind of part of a common experience. So when we eliminate the need to have people participate in things separately in a special way that's different, that's before, that's after, we eliminate these types of questions and wonders, we do kind of level out the ultimate experience for everyone, which does change the impact of disability. When we're talking about accommodations, there's a process associated with accommodations that here at the university we really try to streamline and to make as easy as possible for everyone. But there's still a process. So who's eligible for accommodation? Who grants the accommodation? Who offers their permission to let this happen? And so then again, you would be removing the accommodation and removing this one-up, one-down dynamic, which makes for a more inclusive experience for everyone. And then hopefully, if we're making these types of shifts, we'll see that disability has significant representation in our faculty, in our staff, and in our students. Because that type of representation and role modeling is very critical to demonstrate the way the university considers disability as valuable, I hope, but also for those younger students and younger folks who are considering the University of Arizona, considering certain types of work, disciplines. If they can see themselves represented in those communities, I believe it would help with that pipeline in connecting with different communities. So here are some photos, and these are just a few photos from the U of A's main campus to start thinking about access. So while we've been talking about access and design in different arenas, sometimes it's easier to start the conversation looking at physical access specifically, because I think we recognize physical access a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. We're more used to design around physical access. So I want us just to take a moment and look at this photo and consider the messages that this photo is sending. So this is the Social Sciences building. It's a popular academic building for undergraduate and graduate courses. It's always kind of bustling. And this is one of the main entrances of the building. So relative to access, what do we see? We see a flight of stairs leading to the doorway and a sign. It's a blue sign. I'm not sure if folks can read it clearly, but it's indicating with the wheelchair or the access symbol that the accessible route is around to the right. And we don't know where exactly the access is. The arrow's pointing in one direction. But what this does is, again, it separates folks who need no stairs, okay? So it's confusing. It could potentially be unsafe if you're new to campus, if it's nighttime, if it's crowded, if it's raining. We don't know. We don't know exactly where the access is or what it looks like. But what we do know is that folks who can use the stairs don't have to worry about it and don't have to be inconvenienced. One of the major access points in social sciences is actually through the parking lot, past the dumpster, and through what is sometimes a locked door. So these are extreme examples of access. But again, what is the message that we're sending to everyone in this situation? So that disabled people can be inconvenienced and that non-disabled people kind of see that happening. It just kind of fits with what we think. So this image is really common. I mean, I think it's very common to see this type of access in older buildings. So here's another photo. This is the administration building. So take a few seconds and just kind of look at this photo. Think about what you're seeing here. So this is the main entrance. This is the only accessible entrance to the administration building. You see a large set of stairs that are kind of at an angle, and then a ramp off to the side. So when I show this picture to folks kind of in person, the first thing that people say is that ramp looks very steep. Is it to code? And I believe it is to code, but it is a very steep ramp. What we all may not know is that this whole area, that Alumni Plaza, the Heritage Hill that's just directly kind of adjacent to the east of this entrance, it's all been recently renovated in the last maybe 8 years, so pretty recently. So here is an example of separate access, right? And when I look at that photo, I think, wow, that's unattractive for one of the symbols of our campus. But it keeps disability kind of access separate from the main route. There was a lot of potential to do something better, to do something innovative, and this is kind of where we arrived and where we stayed. What you can't see in this photo is that right on the ramp, there's kind of an embossed stamp that says donated by, and the corporation that donated the ramp. So you can kind of see how this message around charity that we talked briefly about earlier is just real present when it comes to the disability experience. That ramp needed to be there, right? That is the accessible entrance to the building, but yet we're going to slap a sticker on it that says it was donated by, reinforcing the idea that it's separate. It's something that the university was nice enough to offer, or this company was nice enough to donate, when honestly that's not reality. But it's these real subtle messages that we take in and that, again, form our opinions and our ideas about the disability experience. So one last photo of campus. This is the Arizona State Museum. And it's located right off of the main gate of campus, just east of University Boulevard, across the street from Centennial Hall. Now, this museum was also renovated within the last 8 years. And so when you're looking at that, kind of think about what messages that photo is sending. To me, it looks attractive. It looks welcoming. To me, as a wheelchair user personally, I don't see any stairs. I don't see any real steep slopes. And so when the Arizona State Museum chose to renovate, they consulted with Disability Resources. They had a different team of folks and basically started right from the sidewalk, right from the street, and eliminated the need for stairs. There used to be stairs going up to the main entrance. They eliminated that need by kind of just starting to slope from the street. They made it really attractive. They kept really the historic kind of flavor of the building, have some plantings. So basically, this is an example of, I would say, of good design. I'm hesitant to say universal design, and I probably should have mentioned that earlier, because universal really is an ideal. I'm not certain that we can design anything that is universally accessible, but it's certainly a good goal for us to strive toward. And in this case, this is a really nice example of just good design. It eliminates many of the barriers that existed before, maintains the flavor and the history of the building, and it really makes a nice kind of seamlessly accessible building. So those are kind of three examples, I think, of for folks who are on campus. Certainly, we walk or roll or ride by these buildings all the time and might not give them a second thought. But when we really are using that critical lens to explore design, it's important to think about access and the messages associated with how certain people can access certain places. There's a disability studies scholar who recently came to campus, and she uses this great kind of phrase, and basically she says, everybody has to be somewhere, but not everybody can be everywhere. And so if you think about that, it can really inspire us to think differently about our work and how we design environments. So we've talked about accommodations throughout this presentation, and how they are, basically they're consumable, right? They're individual and they're not sustainable. So I do want to provide you with some examples of frequent or common accommodations so you could recognize them in your own practice. But for those of you in the classroom, that might be alternate exam formats or extended exam time. Folks who need time and a half to complete an exam, or potentially for you to design a test that looks different than that Scantron where we have to use our fingers and our hands and our number 2 pencil to fill in those tiny little bubbles. That might mean providing tutors, note takers or scribes. It might be any sort of assistance. In this case, we have registration assistance. But if you have a process where folks need to register, they need to go online, they need to fill out a form, and there's any sort of variance from that main experience, that's an accommodation. It might look like adaptive equipment or technology. There are tons of programs available that make certain materials more accessible for folks. It might be an audio or an ebook that reads to you, or that you can kind of read along with it as you're hearing the text. It could also be some sort of course substitution or a waiver. So, in terms of accommodations, if we can think about our practice and think about what are those examples of barriers to participation or things that we have to do differently for certain students, well, what are the opportunities to redesign that or reimagine it so we do away with these types of accommodations? So when we think about inclusive design, basically, we want to really eliminate the need for anyone to do anything separately. So if we go back to the example of social sciences, that main entrance, it was separate. It's accessible, but the access is separate. So when we're thinking about our own experiences, we want to eliminate the need for separate entrance by, let's say, creating an accessible main entrance that everyone can use together. This eliminates those questions, right? Where's the access? Where's the bathroom? Where are the stairs? Where's the elevator? So we just know that the main entrance is accessible for everyone. We want to provide materials, let's say electronically, ahead of time, so individuals can do what they want with them. They can have an option to modify the size, the contrast, to read ahead, to print them out and kind of read along with you, when you're giving your class or your presentation. This is just an example of something really that doesn't cost much money, if any, at all, but really is a nice step toward inclusive design. And then signage is also very important. So if things can't be perfect, and we can't have one accessible route for everyone, then make sure that the signage is clear. So again, where's the entrance? Where's the elevator? Where's the bathroom? These types of questions that folks will wonder about. You can do a lot in terms of communicating the access points. And I think that we know that we have constraints on our communities. So while we'd love to see everything be universally designed and universally accessible, we have to recognize that this is a process. And so I hope that that kind of takes some of the pressure off, that this is a process and we have to do what we can with what we have right now. But it's that vision of what we want our community to look like and our experiences to look like that will guide us. So in that little box, it's basically saying that we want to strive to make the experience of disabled people and non-disabled people equitable. So we want to eliminate those additional burdens or hurdles or hoops that disabled people, we know that they have to jump through, right? We know they're experiencing inconvenience or kind of just a burden that's hard to kind of quantify. So ultimately, our goal is to eliminate that burden by considering disabled people in the planning process and really wanting disabled and non-disabled people to have equitable, equal experiences on our campuses with our experiences in our classrooms, in our buildings. So if we can just take a moment and reflect on examples of barriers in the environment that exclude people from participation. And that could be in your office, it could be on campus, it could be just any example in the community of something that you can recognize that excludes people from participation or from access. And then, of course, the next question would be, what can you do to remove these barriers to create a more inclusive experience? So it might be easier to think about in your professional roles. If you are an instructor, if you're a supervisor, if you have, the oversight of certain experiences or development of plans and ideas, what can you do in your sphere of influence, with your scope, within your scope, to remove barriers that exclude certain people from participation? And so that, is kind of the take-home message of this presentation, is thinking about design differently. Because when we start thinking about design just broadly, it really does change the conversation on disability, because we're not talking about disability anymore. We're not talking about impairment. We're not talking about individual accommodations. We're not talking about the ADA. We're just talking about good design and access. And so we want things to be accessible. We want everyone to be able to experience our courses, our trainings, our programs, our offices. So how do we do that? And it really leads to a broad conversation around access and equity. Many of the accommodations or many of the alternate design that we reviewed will benefit lots of folks. So not just disabled folks, but English language learners would probably appreciate, let's say, captioning or a printed out copy of a presentation or course materials. Folks who are pushing baby strollers or who have maybe invisible impairments or temporary conditions would probably appreciate smoother physical access. So when we stop trying to approach disability as kind of, I like to say, this cost-benefit analysis, what do we have to do for this one person versus the rest of the community? But we start really focusing on access and the largest, most diverse audience of consumers that we can think of, the conversation shifts and the impact of the disability shifts. So basically, to wrap up, I wanted to share with you what we have on campus relevant to disability resources. Disability Resource Center is available for students, faculty, staff, campus visitors, and community members. So we have a range of folks that we work with. Of course, we provide services for students and faculty around design and accommodations. So we will kind of facilitate those individual accommodations and facilitate access on campus. We also work with faculty and staff on how to create inclusive experiences. And that's something I'm not sure that the campus community really recognizes, but we're certainly a resource for faculty and staff in that way. And in terms of campus visitors and community members, the Disability Resource Center is responsible for access, let's say, in Centennial Hall or at the McHale Center. So when folks come to campus and are looking to have, kind of a fun night or a sports experience or watch a show, we are working with the campus and making sure that there's good access available for everyone. Some of the highlights of our program, we have the largest, I would say most comprehensive wheelchair sports program in the country. So we have 5 sport teams. We have wheelchair tennis, men's and women's wheelchair basketball, quad rugby, which is murder ball, if you've ever seen the movie Murder Ball, and track and road racing. We also have an accessible gym that's open, again, to disabled students, faculty, staff, and community members. Because if you look out across the Tucson community, there aren't very many accessible choices for folks who want to work out or participate in a gym. So that's something that we do offer. We offer scholarships to our student athletes, and so it's a really robust program, really unparalleled by any other college or university in the nation. That's on the first floor. On the second floor, we have an assistive technology lab, which has dozens of computers that are all adjustable workstations and are also fully loaded with different assistive technologies. So whether that's screen readers or certain programs that modify contrast or color or size of documents, text to talk to text, and we have lots of programs that are available for students affiliated with DRC. And we also have student staff and professional staff in the lab at all times. So when it's open, students can come over and learn, how to use different products and learn these strategies to be successful in their courses. We also do document conversion right there out of the DRC. So if a faculty member is using a textbook or certain materials that are inaccessible, the DRC will facilitate that document conversion for the faculty member. We have our testing center on the second floor, which is where folks will come to take their exams if they need, let's say, extended time or minimal or private kind of distraction, minimal distraction. And how that works is that DRC, again, coordinates with the faculty member. So in that spirit of not wanting to add to the burden of the disabled student's experience or create additional hoops for them to jump through, the DRC staff work directly with faculty. They get a copy of the exam, and basically all the student needs to do is show up, just like he or she would have done in the classroom. And then that last bullet point is that we do offer consultation to faculty and staff on inclusive design. And that could be around event planning, it could be around physical access, or it could be around curricular design and really looking at our learning environment and thinking about ways to make it more inclusive so people could participate and access the course at higher levels. And then finally, our contact information. Our website is something that we're developing. It's relatively new. We've just had a new website in the last couple of months, but we're really trying to increase the resources that are available for folks. So if you're interested in learning more about good design or curricular access, we hope that you'll be able to visit the website and find some good articles or good, tips or information. We also have a Facebook page. And we're located over in Highland Commons, which is 6th Street or 6th Avenue and Highland. So right there by the Residence Life offices and by Campus Health and by the Highland Market. So if you ever want to find us, that's where we're located. I appreciate your time today and look forward to questions and answers to follow.